Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We have a very exciting seminar this week, I think. Um, Last week we defined structure. Last week we really started to move towards the theory and get on to what the point of all of this was by defining structure and beginning to understand how it affects states. And Chapter 6 looked at anarchic systems using market theories as a parallel. And use this to build a balance of power theory and begin to test it. So you saw the inklings of what he was talking about in Chapter 6. In Chapter 7, and especially Chapter 8, you really start to see the impact. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So the two chapters will look at different systems, multipolar versus bipolar, and how this affects countries, first using an economic model as a parallel, and then in Chapter 8, he will carry this over onto military. So how this would affect the military relations of states and things like cooperation between states, stability, war, peace, the peaceful nature of states, when states become warlike, etc., all due to the pressures put on them excuse me, by the structure of the system. Exciting stuff, so let's get started. Chapter 7 is called Structural Causes and Economic Effects, and it will look at how behavior and outcomes vary in systems that remain anarchic, as the international system will for the foreseeable future, but whose structures vary through changes in distribution of capabilities across states, which means with different numbers of poles. And it will do this with an eye to answering the question of whether it's better to have many poles or fewer poles. And the next chapter will cover whether it's good to have a few poles or just two, for example. Okay, so how do we count poles? We need to measure power to do that. But before we start, remember when counting poles, remember that Waltz has said several times over and over again that relations between states are unit-level characteristics, not characteristics at the structural level. So we cannot consider an alliance to be a pole. It has to be the states itself, the states themselves, or a state itself. That is a pole. So concluding that the world is bipolar because two opposing blocks have formed confuses relations with capabilities. These are relations between states that have decided to band together. That is a unit-level aspect, not a structural aspect. It does not change the structure of the system. And he talks about the difficulties of this. Of course, there are always difficulties judging, is this country now powerful enough to be considered a pole? Where exactly is the cutoff? So he concedes that it is difficult sometimes, but you only need a rough ranking. And he points out that throughout history, there has generally been a consensus. People can come to a consensus about what the great powers were in any given era. And he says it's about as easy as judging the number of important firms in a particular economic sector. He points out that from the treaties of Westphalia to now, at most 8 states can be considered to have been great powers at any given time. So the largest number of great powers has been 8. And when he wrote this in 1979, there were 2. This was during the Cold War. At this stage, Waltz also takes a moment to point out that there are virtues to inequality. It's obvious that inequality between states leaves some states very powerful and some states weak, and that this might tempt stronger states to try to extend their control over weaker states, and that this also can eventually lead to war. So we might conclude that all states being equal would be better. But he has 2 things to say about that. One thing is that will never happen. That's just inherent in the state system. Some states are quite small geographically. They will never be equal in power. And that said, there are some virtues. And a big one that I sort of point out, he doesn't use the term collective action, but as I see it, that's what he's arguing, is that if there are a small number of major powers, they can make deals and decide to do things together. And the smaller powers that are associated with them, that are in alliances with them, that trade a lot with them, that are close to them ideologically, will fall in line behind these deals once they're made by the big ones. Think of America making rules about participation in its market according to, what have you, corruption and things like that, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. If you want to have anything to do with American business, you have to follow these standards about corruption. So it forces smaller states to take it on. So in reality, it's only the big important states that need to make agreements, and the smaller states tend to fall in line, which allows international cooperation. Picture a world of 180 equivalent states with equal amounts of power, they would have a very difficult time agreeing on anything, because every state would have to agree. Waltz says here that saying that states act according to their interests is completely uninteresting unless that can allow us to figure out what this would lead them to do. And he notes that what you would be led to do by your interests depends on the structure of the system. And he uses a couple market analyses to show that. So if you have a market with near perfect competition, as an economist would say, lots of small producers, none of them with more than, say, 10% of the market. So none of them produce more than, say, 10% of the total volume of wheat. He uses wheat farmers. The world is just a bunch of small wheat farmers. Anything an individual wheat farmer does will have no noticeable effect whatsoever on the market. So if you tried to raise your price as a small wheat farmer, you simply wouldn't be able to sell any of your wheat. Your customers would just shift to somebody else and you would lose everything. So you can't raise your price. And if you lowered your price, well, you'd still sell all of your wheat, but you'd make less money. So why would you do that? So in the end, you will sell wheat at the market price. Or you will either make less money, or if you try to raise it, you'll go bust. There's no point in trying to get together with other wheat farmers, because even if 10 of you banded together, you're all too small to make a difference. Beyond that, you might have significant difficulty making deals and trying to hold things together, forming a cartel. It'd be quite difficult. What's best for the individual in such a system might harm everyone in the long run, but you can't organize to do anything different. This is like the bank run example. So if there's a fall in wheat prices, you as a wheat farmer, if you want to maintain the same amount of profit, you'll have to produce more wheat and sell more in order to keep up. Because remember, you can't raise your price. You'll be forced to lower your price, because if you keep your price high, you won't sell any wheat at all. So you're forced to lower your price, and at a lower price, you'll have to sell more wheat to make the same amount of money. What that means, though, is that as market producers throughout the world do that, the supply of wheat will expand more, and as you know from supply and demand, hopefully, more supply means lower prices with the same amount of demand. So you'll drive prices even lower, making things even tougher for yourself and everybody else. But if you don't lower your price and increase production, you'll lose money. You basically have no choice but to follow the market in this downward spiral. Take a different situation with a smaller number of large producers who have a big impact on the market. They can affect prices. If they raise their prices, some people will shift away from them a bit, but because they control so much of the production in the market, people will be forced still to buy from them. So they won't be able to completely get away from them. So a small number of big producers can affect the market, they can affect prices, they'll have to keep an eye on competitors and try to influence them, and they would have a strong incentive to collude with them, which, by the way, is illegal. Forming a cartel would be illegal, but they would have an incentive to do that. So the first example, it would be a multipolar system, hundreds of poles, for example, a complete equality between states. The second example would be a multipolar system as we actually see them, with 8 or fewer great powers that have an incentive. They have a big stake in the system. They have, a 20% market share or something like that for each power, which means they have a strong incentive for maintaining the system the way that it is. That's the difference between smaller numbers and large numbers. So for producers, it sounds like a smaller number system would be better. Most economic theory is based on trying to avoid the situations that we expressed with large producers colluding and things like that, because market competition is good for consumers. Pure competition means lower prices and higher quality for consumers, and we try to do that as much as possible by making it illegal for producers to get together and things like that. We like more competition. But as Waltz points out, we don't usually think of the competition between states causing some states to be destroyed and others to get larger and larger. We don't usually look at that as a really good thing. And we can't say this state is too powerful, we're going to split it up into different pieces. So it's a totally different system, a totally different goals that we would have and priorities. The equivalent of producers in Waltz's model are the states. So what's good for producers, a smaller number of big producers, is also good for states in Waltz's model. Bigger states have a better chance of survival. Smaller rivals have a harder time challenging them. There's a lower cost of bargaining. It's easier to make deals if there are just a few other big powers that you have to make deals with, or maybe just one other. And each of the smaller the number of great powers there are, the larger the stake that each of them has in the current system, the more power they have in the current system, and therefore the higher the incentive they have to maintain it. And they also have a lower chance of improving their position by changing the system, i.e. by going to war. So smaller numbers of great powers mean greater stability, greater ability for collective action, lower probability of big war. So smaller systems with smaller numbers of great powers are better. He now takes a moment here to counter the liberal idea that growing economic interdependence encourages peace. He notes that interdependence tends to fall as the number of states declines because larger states have larger markets, internally, domestic markets, and will thus provide a higher percentage of their own goods and services. There are plenty of statistics that he provides. Even if you look at today, the United States is not particularly trade dependent. It's seen as a big free trade country, but the percentage of its GDP that's generated from trade or that's spent on trade is very small compared to smaller countries. So it's, as he argues, its level of interdependence with other countries and that of the Soviet Union also with other countries was much lower than previous great powers. And he notes that the fiercest wars and the bloodiest international ones are fought within arenas populated by highly similar people whose affairs are closely knit. Look at all the wars of Europe. Those happen during periods of high interconnectedness and high levels of interdependence. And even World War II was within Europe, and then there was the Asian theater between Asian powers, with countries with people fairly similar and with closely knit affairs and interdependence. And the United States eventually got involved in both of them, giving it a global dimension, but you can argue that both world wars follow that model as well. So if interdependence grows faster than central control, war becomes more likely. So he thinks interdependence is actually a bad thing for war. Now he argues that most people use interdependence to mean sensitivity. Most people use it to mean something happening somewhere in the world can affect someone or everyone elsewhere or even practically everywhere, particularly in economics. And this is what we think of when we think of economic globalization. A small shift in a market in Asia can cause people to lose money in New York and can cause shops to close. The economic crisis of 2008-9 spread throughout much of the world. He argues that this type of interdependence is growing, but from a low base. And in 1979, at least, it was lower than in 1914. And that's probably still true today, and it's definitely true, at least for the United States, because the US and the USSR traded much less with other countries than the UK, France, Germany, and Italy did in the multi-war period before World War I, and that's still true today. Those European countries rely on trade for 1/3 to 1/2 of their economies. They trade big portions. Whereas the United States, I think that makes up only around 10% of its economy, or even less. So it's not very trade dependent. So he says the extent of interdependence is overestimated, particularly regarding the superpowers. And because he thinks interdependence increases the odds of war, he's fairly sanguine about the prospects for war between the US and USSR, because low interdependence and complete non-reliance of the two superpowers on each other means they can essentially ignore each other. There's no reason to go to war with each other. And he turned out to be right. And I should point out, that what I meant by that is within the bipolar system. So his predictions are about bipolarity, not the current unipolar world. We can talk about what he thinks about the unipolar world later. So chapter 7, part 2, section 2, interdependence as mutual vulnerability. And this is what he thinks should be the real definition of it. And you can measure it by the sheer amount of trade, but also its type, which means how critical the goods a state must import are and the variety of alternative suppliers. So if you need to import really important goods that are critical for your survival, like food, and you have very few suppliers for those goods, you're in big trouble. Yeah, but usually you can get food from a lot of sources, so that may not be the case. Viewed in this way, the US and the USSR are not very interdependent with the world, and they're not dependent at all on each other. And he takes the case of the US only, which trades more than the USSR, so should be more interdependent by many definitions. But you see that its trading partners are quantitatively and qualitatively more dependent on it than it was on them. Right, so its trading partners all traded larger shares of GDP than the United States did, so they were more dependent on trade, and they received more critical goods from the United States than vice versa. Even though the United States imported oil and things like that, it imported very little of its oil from the Middle East. There were other suppliers that were possible. Waltz points out at one point that the fact that the U.S. consumed per person 3 times as much oil than other advanced economies meant that if need be, it could cut its oil consumption considerably and live off only domestic oil. So his point is that the United States has had a lot of, and still has, a lot of ways to adapt, and that if a crisis hit, it would hit other countries harder than it would hit the United States. So from theory to practice, he notes that the gap in interdependence between the multipolar system and the bipolar one is much larger than changes in interdependence while each of the systems were in effect. Interdependence much lower in bipolar than multipolar. And he argues that that is structural, that would always be the case. Even during the 1970s oil crises, Middle East oil made up just 3% of US oil supplies, and the US was much better able to cope with them than, say, Europe or Japan. And you can look at the examples he shows there. And in hindsight, we also know that the oil embargo probably hurt OPEC's producers more than it hurt Western countries, because the oil price eventually fell and Western countries found other sources of oil, and OPEC lost market share, so it damaged it more in the long run. Trade is a small percentage of the U.S. economy, but because of the sheer size of the U.S. economy, it's very large in absolute terms, which means the U.S.'s effect on world trade matters a lot. And as a big buyer, the U.S. therefore enjoys the power that comes with that position. Remember, a company is dependent on its customers as well. Dependency is a two-way street. And he goes on with examples of that show how the U.S. was less vulnerable than most other countries. Yes, there's mutual vulnerability, but other countries are even more vulnerable than the United States. It was in a better position. For an example of the political effects of this difference in interdependence, you can look at the European and American responses to the oil crises of the 1970s. And as this was written in 1979, he probably is referring to the 1973 oil embargo. European countries were highly dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and because each of them was small and had a fairly small impact as a buyer, they had no leverage over OPEC, and they thus had to focus on how their decisions affected their access to supplies and markets on which their welfare and survival depended. The US, on the other hand, importing fairly small amounts from the Middle East and having a lot of market power as a buyer, as well as military power and therefore diplomatic power, was able to make its policy according to political and military calculations. In other words, the US stuck with Israel, whereas Europe began to shift slowly away from Israel and towards Arab countries by this situation. In short, again, big, powerful countries have more options than smaller, weaker ones. The US is sensitive as anyone to world markets, but it's still able to deal with swings better than most. In conclusion, Britain and other great powers in the pre-World War I multipolar period were far more interdependent, and they had a much bigger stake in the world due to all their trade relations and their investments in it, and that compelled them to manage those stakes and those investments quite actively and to need to be involved. And in my words, my interpretation is this increased contact and friction with other great powers, making the situation more difficult to manage and war more likely. In the bipolar world, the US and the USSR were much less interdependent and had a smaller stake. If a small country imposed sanctions, or even a group of small countries imposed sanctions against the US, this was much closer to economic self-mutilation than any real attack against the US, whereas sanctions imposed by the United States would have a fairly big impact on small countries that they would affect. So the power was not equal. And much the same is true of military power, but perhaps even more so, which is the subject of the next chapter, Chapter 8, to which we turn now. Finally, moving on to what most of you, especially the war studies students, will have been waiting for, structural causes and military effects. And a notable quote here that sums it up: problems of national security in multi- and bipolar worlds clearly show the advantage of having two great powers, and only two, in the system. So what does Waltz mean by stability? This is important because he admits that he himself used the word messily in previous articles that he'd written. But he means that the system survives. It's not about war, it's about the system remains anarchic, as it will, and the number of great powers does not change. And what I mean by that, it doesn't change from multipolar to bipolar or something else. He notes there's a close link between the survival of the system and the survival of its great powers, but it's not complete. Powers can rise and fall even as the system remains multipolar. You can look at table 8.1. And also changes in number are not always changes in system. You can drop from 8 states to 5 states, to 5 great powers, and the system would still be multipolar. He notes that 3 is a particularly problematic number of great powers because 2 can always join together against the third to bomb it back out of great power status or cut it off economically or divide the state up between themselves. And he also noticed that only 2 systems have ever existed, multipolar, actually with 5 or more members, 5 to 8, until 1945, and bipolar from then. Of course, we know now from 1991 we've also had unipolar. So this is completely new. Unipolarity is completely new, as was bipolarity from 1945. 300 years before that, the world had always been multipolar. The conventional wisdom is that a system with 2 great powers is unstable, or that was the conventional wisdom at least at his time. At least 4 were needed, and a 5th was even better because it could act as a balancer. But he notes it's quite difficult to act as a balancer. You need to have negative interests. In other words, be afraid of what you could lose rather than concerned about what you could gain. So you need to be worried about security rather than about acquiring land or trade, because that would reduce diplomatic options. And as he notes, if you as a great power have designs on the territory of another great power, you'd like to snatch it from them, you can't very well form an alliance with them. You would have to join the opposition, which limits your flexibility. If you need to trade with a certain country, that will limit your flexibility as well. So your interests may limit your ability to shift sides to the weaker side and to balance and things like that. And the balancer, which was always Britain, needs to be powerful enough to be decisive when throwing its lot in with the weaker side. Thus, no other state can be too powerful. And you can think of the effect of Germany in the run-up to World War I. So power requires flexibility, which means a willingness to ditch states you feel ideologically close to or that you have important ties with. That's not very easy to do. This flexibility is tricky. And flexibility requires larger numbers, which entails greater complexity and much more uncertainty, which means less stability. This doesn't make us think this is safer and less prone to war. Once again, he notes that multiple players joining 2 rival camps does not make a multipolar system bipolar, any more than the formation of political alliances turns a multi-party democracy into a 2-party one. Now, he talks about the rigidity of alliances pre-World War I, which is thought by many to have led to the war, but he argues this is superficial. He says if the alliances had been stronger, then greater flexibility would have been possible among their members, and he notes the example of German-British cooperation in 1912-13. If the alliances had been more solid, then greater cooperation between Britain and Germany, which might have forestalled the war, would have been acceptable to the alliance partners on both sides. But because some of the decisions that you make as a great power when you're in an alliance, you need to make considering your alliance members and what they will think of it, because of that, you're limited in your actions, and that limited the actions on both sides to non-cooperation with the opposite side and made war more likely. But it wasn't the rigidity of the alliance. If the alliance had been stronger, it would have been better. No country on either side could exercise control because none of them were large enough, but any one country entering war would bring the others in with it. So it was a precarious situation, and he'll contrast this with the bipolar system in a moment. But first, I'll point out one last thing. In a multipolar system, there are too many actors to enable anyone to see for sure what is happening, and too few to make what is happening a matter of indifference. Put simply, alliances must remain fluid, so trust is difficult. You have difficulty trusting your alliance partners if you know they can leave you at any time and join the opposition. And at the same time, there are very limited options for alliances. You can't just get anyone to join. So each player is forced to worry a lot about its alliance members, because if one player leaves the alliance, the others could be in big trouble. So there's high interdependence. And by worrying about alliance members, you have to worry about what they think about you, worry about whether they're going to stick with you, worry about whether you can hold on to them, whether they trust you, etc. If you've ever watched the show Survivor, you know alliances are really big. Look at page 169 where he talks about the bipolar system, and I'll add in today's unipolar one, it's the same. The US can focus on its main adversaries and discipline its allies because they need it more than it needs them. the US is less likely to get dragged into war and can act flexibly according to its own assessments, and this is indeed what we see. The US does what it wants. Its alliance partners are worried about it, whether it's really committed to them or not, whether what it's doing is a good idea, etc., etc., but the US does it anyway, because it doesn't matter that much to the US if individual alliance partners leave, but it matters a lot to those alliance partners if the US is no longer with them. There's a very low degree of military interdependence in the bipolar and unipolar systems, and a very high degree of military independence for the United States in both of those systems. And Waltz sums this up with, rigidity of alignment in a two-power world makes for flexibility of strategy and the enlargement of freedom of decision. And I would note that this also applies to unipolar world as well. So let's compare and contrast. In a multipolar system, who is a threat is uncertain, because one of your alliance partners could then turn on you and become a threat. Or they could switch alliances. In a bipolar system, it's completely clear. The two opposing poles, that's where the threat comes from. The others are militarily insignificant. In the multipolar system, dangers are diffuse, they're spread out, responsibilities are unclear, and interests are obscure. In the bipolar system, the dangers are clear, you know who the threat is. Responsibilities are clear, it's you. You as the superpower have to do something about it, if anyone is going to do it. And interests are easier to discern, it's easier to figure out what's at stake. In a multipolar system, others can respond to advances by the other alliance. So between Britain and Germany was France. So if things were going on the French border with Germany, Britain could leave France to deal with it. It wasn't sure if it needed to respond. In a bipolar world, the superpowers must respond because they know that no one else will. Potentially anything going on anywhere concerns them, and it's the same in the unipolar world as well. The United States knows that it needs to act, or basically no one else will. Miscalculation in the multipolar world by some or all powers is a source of danger. In the bipolar world, miscalculation is not so much a source of danger because the odds of miscalculating are much reduced because things are much clearer. Instead, the danger is more overreaction by either or both. And in a unipolar world, I would say this is even more true, and Waltz argues this in a later article about the world after the Cold War, that the biggest danger would be that the US would overreact and overreach in its power. And many would argue that that's exactly what happened. He was extremely prescient, even though in this book he seems to deny the possibility of unipolarity, which, by the way, I would say is a failure in his vision rather than a mistake of the theory, because there's nothing in the theory that says it's not possible. It was just him who said that. Further effects of structure in bipolar systems. Competitors get used to each other over time and begin to resemble each other. Actually, that happens in any competitive system. The US and the USSR came to see international politics in similar, pretty realist ways by the 1960s, despite their opposition and ideological differences. And you can read quite a few people who have argued that they acted quite similarly in their foreign policies, despite their differences. Bipolar systems have a high level of inherent tension because of the massive damage each can do to the other, which seems really scary. But at the same time, because there can be no appeals to third parties, no one else can make any difference, which leads to stability. There is also heavy pressure to moderate behavior, because they have to resolve things themselves, the two powers. But luckily, resolving things is easier because bargaining between two parties is much simpler and less affected by fear, that, for example, that an alliance partner would leave, jump off, than bargaining between several. It's much easier. So the fear in bargaining between several parties is that someone might go back on their promise. Bargaining between two parties, I only have to look after one person. If they don't keep to my agreement, our agreement or not. I don't have to worry about lots of different people trying to free ride and things like that. So making agreements is much easier. And you saw arms control agreements between the US and the USSR despite the heavy tensions, because it was fairly easy to negotiate and they could see that it was in both of their interests. So it is not that one entertains the utopian hope that all future American and Russian rulers will be good and cautious, but rather that the pressures of a bipolar world strongly encourage them to act internationally in ways better than their characters may lead one to expect. Either country may go berserk or succumb to inanition and debility. That necessities are clear increases the chances that they will be met, but gives no guarantees. So he's arguing that it is so clear in the bipolar world what is at stake, and that negotiating and bargaining between two powers is so much easier that we can expect the behavior of the leaders to be better than we might expect based on the character of the individual leaders. And he also notes that nuclear weapons only intensify this effect by urging even greater caution in relations between the superpowers. So he's quite sanguine about bipolarity. He thinks it's likely to last a pretty long time. He thinks there aren't any decent challengers that could come up and make it multipolar. He was right about that, but didn't put together that it might end up being unipolar. Although by later in the 1980s, he was arguing that the Soviet Union was in steep decline. And that all of these things, that stability, make war less likely, and so that and nuclear war with it. So he felt that the odds were pretty good. He's one of the few people who was quite sanguine about bipolarity and thought that it was going to end peacefully, and he was right. He argues the bipolar system is durable because the US is still leading. And it's amazing how old the debate about U.S. declinism is. I mean, this is 1979. Apparently people were arguing the U.S. was in stark decline even in the 19th century. They're still saying it today. He notes that it's difficult to think of disadvantages that the United States has that are not worse for other countries. I think this is probably less true today, but we still tend to be overly pessimistic. He also notes that nuclear weapons do not level the playing field, and they don't change the structure of the system, because destructive power alone doesn't make a pole. So just because a state gets nuclear weapons does not mean that it now is a great power. Economic power matters for influence as well, and so does the capacity to deploy other sorts of military force, because other sorts of military force can be used to actually do things, whereas nuclear weapons are defensive weapons. They can help small states deter big ones, but they can't buy small states much additional influence. There's not much you can do with them beyond protection. And also the deterrent power, even the deterrent power of small nuclear forces, is highly questionable. For more detail, you can look at his example of France and Britain on page 181. I'm not going to get into that right now. And now he talks about another thing that would be of interest to my war studies students. Those of you who had Art of War studies with me, or with anyone, will have read Rupert Smith and Martin van Creveld's criticisms of modern power, where they claim that military might no longer buys political control. In 1979, this was also already claimed, and Waltz counters this. He admits that during a great power stalemate, certainly lesser states gain a certain freedom of action. In a bipolar world, leaders needn't worry about the wishes of lesser alliance members, as we've already established. By the same logic, those lesser alliance members are free not to follow the policy that's been set. So when NATO countries let their defense spending drop below the agreed 2% limit, what happens? Not very much. The US pleads with them to pick it up, and nothing else happens. So they have a fair amount of freedom of action as well, even as the US is free to kind of ignore them too. And I'll also note that the US used to free ride on British naval supremacy. In the 19th century, Britain secured the seas, allowing US commerce to expand without the US having to spend a lot of money on a navy. It actually didn't have a navy, I believe, at all. But it was able to use that freedom of navigation granted by Britain and benefit from it and profit from it without paying for it. And the roles are reversed now. He notes that force is least visible where power is most fully and most adequately present. The usefulness of force should not be confused with its usability, because that would be like saying that the police force that seldom, if ever, employs violence is weak, or that a police force is strong only when policemen are shooting their guns, or that a man with large assets is not rich if he spends little money. Right? So it's total confusion of terms here. A police force that is strong, or a society that is well ordered, there's power in that order. The stronger the order is, the less violence is needed to maintain it. And here he extends that logic specifically to nuclear weapons. I think probably all of you are aware of the security dilemma. That's a situation where, let's say, you create a military just to protect yourself from your neighbors. Your neighbors, seeing that you've created a military, established militaries of their own, you look across the border and see that they have militaries that can now meet yours, so you feel less secure, so you build up your military more to make yourself feel more secure, which makes the other states feel less secure, so they build up their militaries. Right? That's the security dilemma. You can't get a dilemma. There's no way to solve it. You're stuck in that situation, but you can handle it in various ways. And bipolarity helps because the two great powers can talk to each other and they can bargain with each other and don't need to worry about shifting alliances or anything else. But He also notes that great powers will do best if they handle the security dilemma with weapons that make waging war between them less likely. Okay, if you build up walls and all kinds of defensive stuff, it won't make the other countries feel less secure, but it will make you feel more secure. So nuclear weapons fit the bill. Nuclear force is useful precisely because of the unlikelihood of its use. So nuclear force is unlikely to be used. You're unlikely to wage war with nuclear weapons, which makes nuclear weapons an excellent way to handle the security dilemma. He also notes that great powers are never masters of their own destinies. This is a completely false view, so it's completely unrealistic to expect them to be able to always get what they want. When great powers are at or near the top, they fight. As they decline, they become peaceful. Think of Spain, Holland, Sweden, and Austria. When they were great powers, they were all fighting each other. Great powers fight because of their positioning in the system, not because of their characters. Have a look at the paragraph at the bottom of page 188. One part sums it up. If sullen disregard is the response to every command, no government can rule. So if everyone just ignores anything the government says, no amount of force will make a difference. If a country, because of internal disorder and lack of coherence, is unable to rule itself, no body of foreigners, whatever the military force at its command, can reasonably hope to do so. Okay? He was thinking about Vietnam, really, but he might as well have been talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. As he notes, militaries can establish control over a territory, but that doesn't mean they can exercise control within it. This is to confuse military and political power. To exercise control within a territory, you need political power, which includes some form of legitimacy, some form of the people there agreeing to do what you say and to organize in the way that you wish. Saying that no other country could bring stability, saying the US could not bring stability to Afghanistan, or at least not very easily, doesn't say much unless you could say that other countries would be better able to do so. But they wouldn't. No country could. So it doesn't really tell us much about US power. What does tell us about US power is its ability to project that power globally, to topple the governments of fairly large countries throughout the world could potentially be toppled by US military. That's power. And it has always been this way. The people on the ground used to perhaps consent more easily to changed government or changed rulers than they do now. But military and political power have always been two separate things, no matter what Messrs. Smith and Ben Crayfeld say. Many definitions of power equate power with control, but they're not the same thing. Power, by this definition, is the ability to get people to do what one wants them to do when otherwise they would not do it. But power is not all that is needed to get one's way. If it were, there'd be no need for political and military strategy. Wouldn't have to use strategy, you could just use power. But power is simply one cause among many. And to say that power is the same thing as control would be to completely ignore the situation on the ground, where different levels of control would be needed, and control would be exercised in different ways, not just power. So Waltz's definition is, an agent is powerful to the extent that he affects others more than they affect him. I think that's quite a reasonable definition, and that's the type of power that we need to be concerned with in international politics. There's an amusing anecdote on page 192 from a Canadian Prime Minister, but I'll leave you to read that yourselves. In conclusion, two great powers can deal with each other and with the world better than more can. Are they also able to deal with some of the world's common problems better than more numerous great powers can? Power does not bring control. What does it bring? What are the positives? And that is the topic for the final chapter next week, chapter 9, which is on the management of international affairs. And then that's it. Thanks a lot, and talk to you next week.